Good morning. Welcome to day one of Synergistic Summit's 2020's virtual user conference. My name is Trisha Alexander, and I'm the Senior Director of Client Services at Synergistic. We're excited to have you, our clients, join us for an information-packed day of sessions. More than 200 of your peers and colleagues have joined us this year for our virtual conference and are registered for this event. We hope that you enjoy the next 4.5 hours as industry experts, C-Tech thought leaders, and your peers share best practices, industry tips, and more with you. A few of the sessions you don't want to miss are What Has Changed Since COVID with Synergistic's Dave Bailey and Denver Health's Randall Fritz. And after the break, we will kick it off with Say What? Yes, security and privacy can work together, with a group of C-Tech thought leaders and University of Cincinnati Health's Fred Bishop. But before we get started for the day, there are a few housekeeping items that I want to walk through with you. On the right side panel of your screen is the communication panel. We want you to be aware of this, as this will be a good way for you to communicate with us and make your experience better. For technical difficulties, please use the chat tab to ask the moderators a question, and we will share slides for each session here. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the session by using the Q&A tab. All submitted questions will be addressed during the Q&A session after the speaker is finished. At the end of each session and before the Q&A, I invite each of you to take a quick one-poll question on how much you enjoyed this session. This will help cater our content for next year's user conference. Also, when the slides are displayed, if they're looking too small for you, please click the full screen by clicking the computer in the bottom right corner of the slides. Now, to get started, it is my pleasure to turn it over to our CEO, Caleb Barlow. Caleb, the floor is yours.
All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the C-Tech Summit. You know, I really appreciate how many of you have decided to join us online this year. Stepping into this role just over a year ago, many of you mentioned to me just how important the summit was for you last year, both in terms of what you learned, but also your opportunity to network with your peers. Now, for me, this is my first summit, and it's certainly a bummer we can't be doing this face-to-face. I've had the opportunity to meet some of you before we all got kind of locked down because of COVID, and I can't wait to get back out there and spend some time with each and every one of you in person. But realizing that may be a while, we wanted to move forward with this summit virtually. We've got a packed day for you, and our goal is to really bring forward expertise that I don't think you can hear anywhere else. So with that, settle in, grab some munchies, and let's start a conversation. Now, one of my big things, and this is just me personally, is to always start a security conversation with an understanding of the threat. In fact, one of the things that I ask my teams to do, and I've done this for years, is to listen to the CyberWire, which is a daily cybersecurity podcast, every morning, so they understand the threat landscape, the attack surface, and can bring those insights into conversations throughout the day. So with that discipline in mind, what's our baseline as an industry? What's our kind of sit rep in all of this, if you will? And, you know, the way to think about this is that, and I realize that many of you are also in end of year budget conversations across your executive teams, and those are probably going to be tough conversations this year. So I wanted to start a conversation with some data that I hope many of you will find helpful in framing the dialogue with your C-suite and your board. And if you need sourcing on any of what I'm going to show you, feel free to reach out. So as we look at this from a healthcare perspective, where do we sit? What's our security posture, and what's changed because of COVID? Well, I think the first thing to recognize is if we talk about threat actors and how sophisticated they might be, you know, and this is a stat that came from before COVID, but 59% of all attacks in healthcare are coming from the inside. Now, that doesn't mean 59% of attacks are coming from a malicious actor on the inside. It could be someone that lost their identity or accidentally, you know, lost some records. But 59% of all attacks have a nexus with an individual inside your organization. Now, the next stat on here, I think, is something that's really got to cause us all pause. And this is a brand new stat, actually, just from last week, we're seeing a 260% increase in ransomware attacks in the first half of this calendar year. Now, what's interesting about that is the bad guys kind of went on hold at the start of coronavirus. We saw ransomware incidents, particularly in hospitals, pause. In some cases, we even saw threat actors say, oh, we're not going to touch healthcare during this. Well, that turned out just not to be the case. They slowed down a little bit, mainly because they were worried about reactions from law enforcement or intelligence agencies, but they're back at it, and they're back at it with a vengeance. But the next challenge is that we're paying these ransoms. In fact, 58% of victims are paying ransoms. And of course, like all things with supply and demand, if you pay, and it's obvious that you're going to pay, they're going to charge more. So we're seeing the average ransomware demand has increased this year up 47% from what we've seen in the past. So not only are more of us paying the ransoms, not only are the ransomware attacks occurring in more frequency, but we're paying more every year. Now, if we think about this in terms of records and record volumes, and this is OCR data from last year, 12.6% of Americans had their healthcare records breached, lost, or stolen, or some sort of inadvertent access in a single calendar year of 2019. 12.6%. I mean, imagine if that was an infection rate in going into a hospital or going to a doctor. It's really just astronomical in terms of the number of records that are breached on an annual basis. But of course, last year actually wasn't the worst year on record. Now, some other data to add into the mix, and this comes from IBM and the Ponemon Institute, where they do an annual cost of a data breach study. What they found specific to healthcare is the average cost of a data breach in healthcare specifically is up 10.5% year over year, averages 7.13 million. The cost per record seems to kind of go up and down year over year. It's, goes anywhere from typically like $200 to $400. And a lot of that gets skewed up and down just due to large scale breaches. But again, average cost of a breach, not including mega breaches, is $7.13 million specific to healthcare. Now, what's most alarming about that statistic is that's nearly double the average cost in any other industry. And that's due to two primary factors. One, healthcare data contains immutable data, everything from social security numbers to credit card information, the things you can't change about yourself, your identity, your healthcare records, your ailments, your prescriptions, medications, mental history, mental health history. All of that is in a healthcare record, meaning it's ultimately worth more to the bad guys, but it also costs more to mitigate. And regulatory fines and fees can also typically be higher. Now, in total, what we're looking at over the last 10 years, so since 2009, is 70% of the US population has had their healthcare information impacted, i.e. stolen or inadvertently accessed. So in the last 10 years, 70% of it has gone out the door. Now, okay, so that's kind of the threat side of this and what bad guys have been up to. What about this rapidly changing environment now due to COVID-19? Well, we basically sent everybody to go work from home. And the analogy I like to use here is, imagine a medieval castle. The princess is locked up in the tower, either with the jewels around her neck or in a safe. And we basically told everyone to run out of the castle, drop the drawbridge and vacate the castle, right? So a lot of our traditional security provisions that we put around the castle, the moat, the drawbridge, or in this case, the intrusion prevention system, the firewall, those aren't doing us any good with all of our remote office workers out there working from home. And in a lot of cases, people didn't have the equipment that they needed to work from home. The billing clerk might not have been working off of a laptop, and now he or she is working off of a shared computer at home that Junior's playing Fortnite on after hours. And, not only is that a concern, but the home router is probably 10 years old and has never been patched since the day it was bought, and it's Bitcoin mining in the evening. And, you can imagine the environment here that we've been forced into, and we did what we needed to do, is problematic. But also we see things like telemedicine being accelerated, 5 or 10 years, but using consumer grade tools like Zoom. And we've seen a rapid influx of unmanaged devices to address the COVID-19 response, everything from ventilators to infusion pumps. And many of these devices are gathering patient data. And we need to be concerned about two things. One, where do the devices come from? Were they patched? Were they on the right levels? Are they vulnerable as they get plugged into our networks in a hurry? But also, what's now happening to all of that patient information as that device is now being repurposed and sent back to wherever it came from? Is that data being wiped? Is it being sanitized? And how are those devices being managed moving forward? Increase in regulatory issues, probably the biggest one being California Consumer Protection Act, obviously GDPR, CMS. And the next thing, and I'm curious of your comments on this, this is more of a personal prediction than anything I've got kind of third-party data, but we've seen industry consolidation in healthcare for years. My gut says that it is going to accelerate at a very rapid rate. Although there are some systems that are doing very well. In fact, some systems are posting record profits this year. There are many, many systems that are in severe financial crisis because of what they had to do with COVID, and we're likely to see more industry consolidation. Now, where consolidation is a huge risk is as systems consolidate, we're not necessarily seeing people going out and vetting the security posture of the companies and the systems they bought before connecting them to their network. And we've seen many instances where System A not only inherits the capabilities of System B, but also inherits the advanced persistent threat, the bad actors, and all the vulnerabilities of System B. And lastly, increased connectivity, data sharing, information blocking, the whole API economy. This is here to stay. And on one hand, some of what's happened here is really amazing, like the acceleration of telemedicine. But as security and privacy professionals, we've got to lock this thing down. So what does that next normal look like? Well, first of all, the threat landscape specific to healthcare has grown as attackers have moved from other targets, such as airlines, hotels, retails, that are less lucrative during COVID-19. I mean, let's face it, what's the point of attacking a hotel chain right now if nobody's staying there? There's no money in that. They're going to go after open soft targets like healthcare, and with kids heading back to school, like education. But the attack surface has also changed, and it's grown dramatically because, again, we vacated the castle. Everybody's now working from home. It's a whole lot easier for a bad guy to get a beachhead on your system and a remote office worker than it is to break their way through your firewall and try to get access to your EHR. And we're also seeing boards now asking lots of questions, especially as people are in financial crises. Do our security investments actually work? And of course, lastly, we have to note ransomware. It's ultimately having a kinetic impact on just about everything we do. Now, so that's kind of our situation report. What about the bad guys? What impact is COVID having on the bad guys? And as we start off the day, I want to try to give you some different things to think about. So let's put our mind in the eyes of a bad guy, right? What's different for this? Well, first of all, remember that they're human. So if we flip this whole thing upside down and backwards, what impact is it having for them? So the first thing to put in context is cyber crime. So I'm not even talking about nation state activity, just criminal activity. $1.5 trillion industry. Now, to put that in perspective, the gross domestic product of Ireland is only $382 billion a year. The cybercrime industry is $1.5 trillion. So has it shut down? Has it been impacted? Oh, yes, it has. And remember, this is big business. Travel, entertainment, retail, education, these were all major lucrative targets of the campaigns of these adversaries, both nation state and organized crime. But when they shut down, all those campaigns, all that effort, all that reconnaissance work was not worth as much. It's not like a closed retailer is going to pay a ransom unless maybe their online systems get locked up. And also remember, they're people. They're quarantined too. So just like the rest of us, they had to figure out how to work from home. And guess what? Setting up a home office for bad guy activity is not easy. Not only do you need to find a place to work quietly away from the dog and the kids and the family, but you've got to make sure that you're not going to get tracked down. You've got to make sure your internet connection is hidden. This stuff is not trivial. And to set it up takes some time. So we literally saw bad guy activity drop off a cliff for the first couple of months until they got their home offices set up, until they retooled, and until they got their businesses back to normal. But make no mistake about it, this is kind of a down year for them, or at least it started that way, and they're starting to make things up. Now, I see the impact on the adversary really in two ways. First, who are you going to target? What's often referred to as the threat landscape. Now, historically, the most likely to be attacked industries were things like financial services, manufacturing, and interestingly enough, travel. Travel had pretty much moved to the top of the pack right underneath financial services last year, as nation state actors realized that by looking at the travel patterns of individuals, you could reveal a lot about their habits, their employment. You could even figure out someone's religion if you understood their travel patterns and location. But this threat landscape has totally changed. What we mean by this is the actor, the campaign, their motivations changed. And again, remember, they're human. So past targets, less lucrative. We've got to go after new targets. And it wasn't like targeting education over the last couple of months was going to make any sense. Well, probably does in the last couple of weeks. Interestingly enough, what did we see as evidenced by schools in Connecticut last week had to delay opening due to ransomware? So remember, just like the economy has changed for all of us, it has also changed for the bad guy. They're making money in new places, new industries, and now they're starting to target things like the COVID-19 response. If you're a nation state actor, getting underneath what a pharmaceutical company is doing, or research, or even contact tracing data is incredibly helpful. So point being, just like any other business, the business of cybercrime has pivoted to a new normal. And that's important to you, because the more you understand about what the adversary is thinking, the more you can understand about what you now need to defend and where you want to place your priorities. Now, the second impact of this is more of a theory. And it's a theory that, frankly, is going to be a little bit difficult to prove, but I still think it's worth mentioning, and follow me along. I call this the rise of the hobbyist hacker. Now, there are professionals in this industry and there are hobbyists, just like anything else. And the hobbyists typically had a full-time job, and then they just broke into things and stole things on the weekend or at night for the fun of it, or as the bad guys call it, the lulz. So let's say your primary job during COVID-19, you lost. And now all of a sudden the hobby becomes the career. So what does this mean, though, in the overall bad guy ecosystem? It means you have a lesser skilled individual in the same dark web forums, buying the same tools, executing the same types of attacks as the professional, but without the same level of experience. And this can be problematic in the bad guy ecosystem, as it introduces these new actors into the mix that aren't necessarily following the same rules of engagement and the same norms. And that's how these undergrounds work. So, for example, if bad guys execute ransomware, don't unlock the systems, that's going to hurt everybody in the ecosystem. But more hobbyists in the mix can also drive up the cost of commodity tools. We've seen the cost of phishing kits accelerate as more hobbyists come into the space. But the other concern in the ecosystem is that non-professionals are more likely going to trip up. They've got a better chance of burning a forum or doing something stupid in their world where they're going to get turned into law enforcement. So what this means is the professionals get a little gun shy in some cases. And you have this whole challenge in the ecosystem of the professionals and the non-professionals all going on, as the non-professionals are now taking this on as their full-time job. So my point in all of this is the bad guys have been disrupted, just like the rest of us. Okay. So what can we learn from this pandemic? And I want you to sit back and think about, what are some of the things we can take away, learning for how we responded to the pandemic? And one of the first things I think we have to ask ourselves when thinking about a large-scale security incident like a pandemic is, what capabilities and resources do we have to respond? What are the systems, the infrastructure that are so critical that they have to maintain resiliency even during a devastating attack? Now, what you see here are the 16 critical infrastructures as defined by the US government. Notice healthcare is on there, along with other industries you'd expect, like energy and water and communication. But let's remember what happened in the early days of COVID-19. What do we need? It was a whole lot more than masks and gowns and ventilators. We needed a new way to work. We needed a new way to educate our kids. We needed a new way to communicate. And this quickly became more than a public health crisis. It was a financial crisis and ultimately an economic crisis. So what I want to say is that these 16 sectors are definitely important, no question about that. But I do believe this is a little bit of a World War II mentality of what our systems and economy really relies on. So ask yourself, just sit back and close your eyes for a second. What did you really need in those first few days as a security or privacy professional to help you and your team execute? Well, I think, let's ask a new question. Is this critical infrastructure? What about Zoom? So Zoom's now a classroom for educating our kids. It's a place we go to work. It even substitutes in some cases as a bar where we can engage with friends and have a drink. Would you be at work right now without web conferencing? Heck, we wouldn't be having this conference. Would your kids be at school? So is this critical infrastructure? Well, the bad guys certainly think so. 500,000 Zoom passwords were put up for sale in April. We're seeing disruptive Zoom calls is becoming such a thing. It's got its own word of Zoom bomb. Okay. Well, what about, let's say, Amazon and Walmart? Now, how differently would our lives have been in March without these two companies? Now we look at food and agriculture as critical infrastructure, but do we consider the distribution mechanism as critical? And let's face it, how were you going to get your 47 rolls of toilet paper if you didn't have Amazon and Walmart? All right, so the next one I'm going to throw up here is a little bit different and probably not one you're thinking about. What about Garmin? So Garmin, I think a lot of us think of as a fitness devices. Maybe you've got an old Garmin, navigation system in your car. But what you may not realize about Garmin is they're one of the primary providers of navigation instruments and GPS information and mapping to the maritime and aviation industry. And when their cloud services went down in the middle of this pandemic due to ransomware, it impacted some of those navigation systems and their connections to the cloud where they get information infrastructure. So this question, and what I want to ask you here and get you thinking about is, with something like Garmin, it's not really so much about disruption, right? Obviously, if your GPS is down, that can cause some problems if you're flying a plane. But that's not what happened. Bad guys got access to the back end and locked it up with ransomware. And the thing I always try to remind people is, if I can lock something up with ransomware, I can steal the data too. And we're starting to see that happen more and more with ransomware, right? Bad guys not only go in, they lock up the system, and then they say, oh, well, we'll release the data. But the real threat here isn't even releasing the data. It's changing the data. What happens if a bad guy in this incident, and this did not occur, but started modifying information in Garmin's network? What would happen if in a ransomware incident, rather than locking you up or threatening to release some patient records, what would happen if the bad guys changed a record? Could you even find what record they changed, especially if they were in there purporting to be one of your employees? That's the real risk here. And I think the Garmin incident really underscores the potential of what happens if a bad guy changes data. And what about Twitter? Okay, so a 17-year-old kid gets access via vishing to two presidential candidates, a former president, multiple celebrities, and other influencers. Man, could this have been a lot worse? Now, you may not remember this, but in 2013, the AP News Twitter account was hacked, indicating there was an attack on the White House and Barack Obama was injured. And it only took a few minutes for people to realize that this was not true. But in that short period of time, and you see the blip here on the screen, that AP account directly resulted in the stock market losing $136 billion in market capitalization almost immediately. Now, imagine if this 17-year-old had fostered a conversation between world leaders, versus just asking for Bitcoin. And the point here, as we think about our systems, and many of you think about your EHR environment, it's about trust. Now, it's one thing, and I'll dip into politics for a second here, and I'm not making any kind of political statement, but it's one thing, let's say, to not agree with our political leaders and what they may say on Twitter. And there's certainly plenty of that these days. But it's a whole other thing if you don't know if that message is actually authentic. That brings us into a whole other realm of problems. It's a one thing for the president of the United States to say something you might not agree with. It's a whole other thing if everyone's scratching their heads going, did he actually say that? So if this is now the preferred communication mechanism of government leaders around the world, including the president of the United States, do we need to think about Twitter as maybe critical infrastructure? And here's the reason why I bring all this up. What does all this have to do with your world? I want you to ask yourself a simple question. As you're having that next presentation to your board, what is your critical infrastructure that you've learned now because of the COVID-19 pandemic? What is it that no matter what must maintain resiliency during a large-scale cybersecurity event? My guess is your answers have probably completely changed over the last couple of months. Okay, so that's critical infrastructure. What about taking this up the next level? And I love this. I could not find the sourcing on this, by the way. So I have no idea where this came from, but I found it on the internet. I just love this picture of kind of the Great Firewall of China, and I think everybody kind of knows what that means. But what about the internet in general? Like, is it a global public resource? And there's a lot of debate and dialogue about this. And I'm not in any way taking an opinion on that. Is it a domestic resource? Should it be protected, and to what end? And if we learned anything during this pandemic, it's that it's about our reliance on the internet. A working, robust internet drives our whole economy now. And under quarantine, it became the lifeblood of our day-to-day lives, right? Social distancing, quarantines enacting, it's how we went to work, it's how we procured supplies, it's how we educate our kids. So if this is maybe a public resource, if it's maybe a critical infrastructure, don't we need to protect it at any cost? But this has also become a political issue. So authoritarian governments have been attempting to control the internet for years. Now, as a free society, we probably see these barriers more as a problem for impeding free speech or the ability to protest. But let's ask a slightly different question here. Now, one of the things we learned during coronavirus is that barriers can stop the spread of an infection. And follow me through the analog here. Just look at what they've been able to do in New Zealand, right? Where it's essentially an island nation. They test everybody coming in, and effectively life is back to normal in New Zealand because they're able to isolate themselves. Now, I'm not in any way advocating a great firewall, but it does cause us to ask a question. Is it important that somebody at some level has the ability to filter what travels around on the internet? Is it important that we have the ability to isolate systems, companies, or entire populations in the event of a large-scale self-propagating cyber incident? Something like NotPetya, but without a kill switch. Now, it's a very slippery slope of going down that path. But if we learned anything from COVID-19, it's a completely open society is much more susceptible to viral spread. And I would argue the same thing is true for some type of self-propagating cybersecurity incident. Again, kind of like what we saw with NotPetya. So this is the point where I want you to ask yourself another question. Can you filter what's coming in and out of your network? Can you cut off access? Can you really do it? Have you tried it? Can you segment your network? And look, we spend a lot of time with all of you all doing, security assessments. I know most of you have no ability to segment your network. And that's something we've got to really rethink as a priority coming out of this. Now, what's another thing we learned out of this pandemic, right? Well, who's in charge? So again, imagine not a pandemic, but now a large-scale cybersecurity incident. Who is the boss? Who's making the decisions? Because this is a crisis event. If we learned anything out of COVID, making decisions and crisis decision-making is a totally different type of management. You make decisions quickly, you reevaluate those decisions constantly based on the new data you've got coming in. Any of you have a military background, you work your OODA loop. So let's say the cyber Armageddon comes and it's time to respond. Big, NotPetya level kind of attack, no kill switch, propagating like crazy. Who's in charge if this event is global in nature? All right, well, let's take a couple of examples. Let's say something really kinetic, like a dam. The dam's overflowing, it's flooding the village. If you look at this picture here, which one of these people is probably the one in charge? It's probably the fire chief, literally. Now, does the fire chief even understand that this might be a cybersecurity incident? Do they know who to call? Well, what happens if it's a worm leveraging an operating system? Probably somebody like maybe Microsoft that's in charge. Well, what happens if attribution comes into play and it's a nation state? Worse yet, what happens if we're blaming a foreign adversary and the attribution is actually wrong and it turns out to be a 17-year-old kid? What happens then? Who makes the call? Who develops that cure for a cybersecurity incident? It probably has to come from the security community. And what happens if it has a kinetic impact? So my point here is we've got to build the plans of connective tissue together now before that crisis occurs and realize, and I think this is one of the new things I took away from this, we have to realize there may be competition for who's in charge. There may be competition for who's going to come up with the cure. Now, I think we would all expect the security community competing with each other. You know, every vendor of a firewall, IPS, and SIM is going to be claiming they've got the solution to the problem. But what if governments are competing to solve the problem? What if they're competing on attribution? We've got to find a way to engage the private sector. And again, this is a point where I want you to think about what is your engagement between you and healthcare, you and others related sectors or unrelated sectors, you and government, you and law enforcement. You know, you've got to build that connective tissue now and build those run books now. There's a great quote here that came from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. There's a report that came out in May. And by the way, I think this is an amazingly well-written document. And I would definitely encourage you to read it. But the pandemic has laid bare the limitations and interdependence of both the private sector and government authorities, highlighting that any successful management of a crisis, cyber or otherwise, will require a well-coordinated, well-planned, and shared response. And I would argue if we're not building that connective tissue now, we are all going to have a problem. Okay, so let's now say this gets really ugly. Let's say we've got nations blaming each other for the cause, attribution's not completely clear, it's going to take months to resolve. Or let's even just say, you know, this is an issue that's occurred between you and maybe your supply chain. What are the laws when it comes to cyber conflict? Now, I mentioned this is kind of I wanted to give you at least something along the way in this conversation of a book to read. I would actually call this more of a skim than a read. But for any of you that are kind of interested in the intersection of cybersecurity, privacy, and the law, this is an absolutely fascinating skim. 20 renowned international law experts, it's the second version of this, actually get into what laws are on the books and how would they apply to cyber conflict. And of course, what you realize, the laws are on the books are all written about a projectile moving from, you know, country A into country B. No one's thinking about a self-propagating virus that you can't figure out, you know, attribution, and it may even look like it's coming out of the private sector. And these lawyers really get underneath how would that issue likely unfold? What is the case law that's in place? And what do they think are the black letter rules governing cyber operations? So that's my kind of suggestion of it. Again, not so much a read, but an interesting skim. Okay, continuing our journey of what can we learn out of a pandemic that we could apply to a cybersecurity incident. Here's something I never would have thought of thinking about in a run book or a crisis communications plan, but misinformation and disinformation. And I think this is one of the most powerful things we learned out of the coronavirus pandemic is that any good plan, any crisis plan has to be able to combat misinformation and disinformation. And honestly, I've never seen it once in a run book, and I've looked at hundreds of run books over the years. So how do we do this? What happens if your company's drawn into the mix? You know, do you have those crisis communications plans in place? Do you know how to communicate at scale and have those trusted outlets that you can ensure your message gets out. And look at the areas right now where we're seeing confusion and fake information, everything around prevention of this virus, what will cause it, what will kill it, the race to a vaccine, the source of the virus, the efficacy of wearing a mask or not. We've seen all kinds of confusion around that. And if you really kind of unpack that, what you see is that the speed at which this information spreads, particularly when it's fake, is lightning fast. And what I want you to realize is that communications is such an integral part of dealing with a breach. In fact, in a lot of ways, if you think about the major breaches over the last 10 years, the executive response and communication to the breach often, in fact, I would go so far as to argue more often than not, causes more damage than the actual breach did, right? It's people bungling what to say about it, not getting in front of it, and then it's a cover up. But we've never had to deal with misinformation and disinformation around a breach. And I think that's coming. And, it's just another thing that we've got to learn out of this. Okay. So as we went into COVID, and many of you fit in this camp, we had a lot of heroes, right? The doctors, the nurses, the healthcare workers, the educators, the grocery workers, and even the security teams that, buckled down to keep things running and doing everything we could to get the systems and infrastructure in place that we needed to manage the pandemic, right? But the thing was, we kind of knew who the heroes were. We knew who to call on. And you saw lots of really amazing stories of these heroes moving around based on where they were needed. When the crisis originally unfolded in New York City, we saw healthcare workers from around the country and around the globe descend into New York to help. And we continue to see that today. In a lot of cases now, a lot of the heroes that are emerging out of this are helping and find new ways to educate our kids. But if this is a cybersecurity incident, where are we going to get the heroes? And there's a great website that you can use in your next board presentation if you're trying to get people. It's cyberseek.org. And this allows you to drill down right at the state level of how many open cybersecurity jobs are there right now. And, right now, in the middle of this pandemic, there's 507,000 open jobs just in the United States. Heavy concentration of skills in the private sector. And what I want you to think about here is not just what do you need on your staff for your day-to-day piece, which, let's face it, most people need more than what they have. But how and where are you going to get access to surge skills with cybersecurity experience if you need them? Do you have those relationships in place? And we can also use this metaphor to talk about the supply chain as well. Where are you going to get access to the cybersecurity equivalent of the masks and gowns and PPE during a large-scale incident? And the example here to remind everyone of was when Saudi Aramco was first attacked with the original Shamoon attack, right? So this is kind of the first major destructive attack we saw in the oil and gas industry. It took out 35,000 systems in a matter of hours. And the thing is, these systems were down. You basically would have to completely wipe them to the point of low-level formatting to get them to work again. And because this was the first variant of Shamoon, no one really knew what they were dealing with. So the risk here was really high. Now, in the case of Saudi Aramco, oil company, obviously well-funded, and they exercised their muscle. They literally put executives on planes with bags of cash, flew those private jets to Southeast Asia, and purchased every single computer hard drive currently on the manufacturing line at a premium. In one fell swoop, they bought 50,000 hard drives. They sent the entire supply chain for hard drives and computers into a flurry for months, but they were able to recover their infrastructure. Now, I'm not saying you need a private jet and a bag full of cash by any way, shape, or form, but this is a good example to think about of where are you going to get surge capabilities? If you need more equipment, if you need hard drives, if you need systems, where are you going to get them? And where's that recovery capacity of people come from? Do you have those vendor relationships to get it? And, it's funny. One of the things I see people doing more and more is actually not recycling their old equipment, but formatting it, putting a copy of, email client and Microsoft Office on it and putting it on a shelf. I mean, yeah, the battery's going to go to hell, but if you lost hundreds or thousands of systems, at least you've got computers that you can boot up and get running. I mean, these are the types of things that people are starting to think through. So how can we prevent this? And, as you bring forward your dialogue to your executives, at the end of the day, this is a math problem. And look, I'm going to first, before I walk you through this is as back of the napkin as it gets. But hopefully I give you enough here that you can start to kind of add your own data and your own variables to this to build the level of dialogue that you need. Now, we know that many, if not most, healthcare institutions are not meeting the national standards yet on cybersecurity. And we're going to talk more about that later in the week. We also, and we talked about this earlier today, 12.6% of healthcare records were stolen just in last year. And that's from OCR data. And we know from the IBM Ponemon data that the average cost of a breach is somewhere around $429. Now, I know that team really well. They'll tell you, look, it kind of goes up and down every year. This year was a little down from that in terms of the cost per record. But let's just say, for argument's sake, for now, again, our back of the napkin math, let's just say it's $300 per healthcare record. It's a conservative estimate. So you've got 200,000 patient records under management, and your security posture is, let's say, average. And average means, unfortunately, we lose about 12.6% of those records in a year. So what financial risk are you carrying? And this is a great formula to show your executive team. Risk is likelihood times impact. Everybody kind of understands that from high school math. So a risk is 12.6%. Your likelihood is you got 200,000 records. Your impact is $300 a record. That's a $7.6 million risk that you're financially carrying. And again, tweak those numbers on your own. Be more conservative, be less, use other data. There's tons of it out there. Happy to help you with this. But my point is, when you're going forward to make that argument to your executive team that, hey, look, I need $500,000 or $1 million to fix this problem, you've got to start showing them the overall risk that you're carrying as an organization. And I think numbers like this make it pretty easy to make that kind of argument. So what actions can we take out of this as we kind of come back around and summarize this whole thing? Evaluate your critical infrastructure. What is it that you depend on that must be resilient no matter what? Build those run books. And I'll tell you, ask yourself, do you really have run books? And if you think the answer is yes, I want you to go out in the next hour and ask somebody, show me our run book, let's say on ransomware. If you don't get that run book back in 10 minutes, then you don't have a run book because people don't know how to find it. If you look at it and it's not well written and it doesn't articulate who's in charge, how you communicate, how you gather information, how you make decisions, then it's not a run book. And if you need help building run books, give us a call. We love doing it. What relationships are critical during a crisis? That whole point of who's in charge. And, I can't tell you how many times I ask, well, who's in charge during a cybersecurity event? Like, oh, the CEO. I'm like, all right, what happens if the CEO is on a plane for the next 12 hours? Oh, I don't know. Well, maybe you need to rethink that. How do you ensure that you're getting the perspective you need to make decisions during a crisis, whether you're going to pay a ransom or not, whether you're going to turn off systems or not? The one variable you do not have is time. And you've got to think these things out ahead of time. Control the message. Build those holding statements for crisis communications. Ensure you can control multiple channels of communications. You know how to communicate with your team internally and know how to communicate even when your phones are down, because guess what happens in a ransomware incident? All those voice over IP phones, they drop. But also, how are you going to communicate externally? How are you going to get a message to your patients, to your providers, to your community of what's going on and ensure that you can combat misinformation and disinformation? And look for signs of lateral movement. Now, we'll talk more about that over the course of the day, but use things like compromise assessments, access logs, endpoint protection. This is all about realizing that attack surface and threat landscape has changed, and therefore so should your priorities. Anyone now that's getting an assessment for us post-COVID, it's probably very different than what that assessment looked like pre-COVID, because we're thinking about the new attack surface and the new threat landscape in your priorities, and identify and retain those heroes. Know who's on your team, know who you can get for surge skills, even if they're a contractor when you need it. So that's kind of my quick take on some things to think about as we look back at the pandemic and we try to apply that metaphor to cybersecurity. And Trish will now open the floor up to any questions. If you do have a question, please enter it into the chat window, and Trish and I will see that.
Thank you, Caleb. That was wonderful. I do have a couple of questions that have come through. We welcome any others that would like to be submitted in the Q&A section. You can just click on that and enter those and we'll see them. But Caleb, I did get a question from someone. Given your background, what approach to testing runbooks, IR, et cetera, have you seen to be the most effective in preparation given the spike in ransomware?
Well, look, anyone that knows my background, and if you don't, just Google it. I'm not trying to show off, but I've done some pretty crazy things over the years of trying to get executives to think differently, particularly at the board level. I love immersive exercises, not tabletops, but where you actually go through the steps of finding out, is your runbook really going to hold? And interestingly enough, I love doing these things in healthcare because healthcare is one of the few industries that actually really understands how to respond to a crisis. I mean, look at what all of you have been doing over the last 6 months. But do you have those plans written down for cyber? And are you constantly reevaluating, rethinking, and testing them? And you know what? If done well, they can be a fun exercise for a team and an executive team and give you a level of confidence that, okay, if we get hit with this, we know how to handle it. But here's the other thing. All of you have budgets, and those budgets are under constraints like never before. There are going to be some things that you can't fix that you know are a problem in your budget. What I want you to do this year, for those things that you just can't afford to fix, make sure you've got a run book in place for that, whether it's a ransomware incident or a destructive attack or a rogue insider or an APT. Let's at least get that run book built so that if it is exercised, if you do become vulnerable to that, at least we know how to respond. And here's the other thing. Just going through the process of building that run book helps your executive team understand the potential implications. So there's a pretty good chance you're going to get a budget to fix it next year.
Thank you, Caleb. One other question came in about how often or those should be updated, or what may prompt the need for an update on a run book.
Well, I mean, look, I think every run book probably needs to be updated coming out of COVID. And I'm not trying to like create a ton of work for people, right? But everything's changed, right? We've got to re-look at that. And I would say on a regular basis, they should definitely be updated at least annually.
Okay, I'm just giving everybody one more minute to get their questions in.
About how many, you talked about ransomware being paid at fairly high rates. That is very true. How many cyber criminals have been caught, stopped, or prosecuted? That's a tough one. And look, I'll say this in two ways. On one hand, particularly when we're talking about things like ransomware, most of these folks are operating out of geographies where it's damn near impossible to extradite the individuals and bring them in front of U.S. law enforcement. Now, that being said, some of the things that the FBI in particular has been able to do recently is absolutely astounding in terms of their ability to track down adversaries. And, you know, I think one of the things that our law enforcement community is realizing is that this is organized crime. And in fact, because it's organized, it isn't so much about trying to prosecute the low-level offenders, which, you know, is typically what you think about in a law enforcement action. It's how do you take off the head of the organization? And some of the recent takedowns are really impressive. I've personally had the opportunity to be involved in a couple. And I think, you know, I guess my kind of public service announcement with this is, if you haven't gotten to know your local FBI agent, think about joining InfraGard. Get to know those folks because you're going to need them during a big incident. And, you know, they're not the enemy, right? They're working with you. And when you have to call in law enforcement or even government around a large scale incident, I will tell you 99.99% of the time, you've got a partner there that wants to help you. And if you can build those relationships ahead of time, it's going to go a lot better. Any other questions, Trish?
It looks like someone's typing one, so I'll give them a second. I want to remind everyone about the poll. There is just one quick poll question we'd love for all of you to answer. And then one other note, under the People tab, if you guys want to message other attendees, you are welcome to do that as well. You'll have to check on your name to make sure you're not getting any messages in there. But Caleb, I do have one more question that just came in. With our change in work, more teleconferencing, more work from home, more telemedicine, what should our focus be on?
Oh, let me just say this. I cringe to say this, and I know a lot of you are going to cringe when I say it, but it's got to be said. You're going to have to protect the home network. And everybody on the phone just breathed a huge sigh, because how the hell are we going to do that? But we're going to need to figure it out, right? I mean, unfortunately, the home network is now an extension of your enterprise. And I'll tell you what we've done at Synergistic, right? I've started reimbursing people at a higher rate for their internet connection. We're encouraging our employees to make sure that, things like Wi-Fi routers, maybe go rent it versus using that 10-year-old router you've had in the attic. We're going to have to really rethink what's running on your home network, getting the right types of VPNs in place, the right types of endpoint protection, because let's face it, that is now the weakest link. So think of it this way. If you don't have endpoint detection response, not antivirus, but EDR deployed pervasively, you got to get moving on that this year. If you don't have multi-factor authentication over everything with your people operating remotely, got to be a priority for this year. And this is the hard one. If you can't segment your network, you got to get working on that. And I know that's the biggest challenge for everybody on the phone.
All right, Caleb, how important do you see zero trust for healthcare organizations?
Oh, I think zero trust is just a great way to, I'm a huge proponent of zero trust. It helps resolve a lot of the issues you may see, because in a zero trust environment, you're not thinking about who's inside the firewall. You're basically assuming everything's dirty. And that's kind of how we have to think about things now, especially with 20, 30% of our workers working from home in environments that, well, we can't trust. All right. Well, Trish, I realize while we're waiting for any other questions, just a plug here. So at the bottom of the hour, you've got two choices. You can go to what has changed since COVID-19, and really dive into that with Randall from Denver Health and Dave from Synergistic. In addition to that, I've got to give a plug for my former colleague and very good friend of mine, Itai Mayor, who's going to be talking about thinking like a hacker. And if you've never heard Itai speak, he's one of the most renowned dark web researchers out there, and he just finds, well, crazy stuff. And he's going to talk a little bit about where he's found some healthcare crazy stuff out there. So you've got both of those sessions coming up in about 6 minutes, and you get to pick which one you want to go to. Any other questions, Trish?
Wonderful. Thank you, Caleb. No more questions at this time. Everyone, thank you for joining us this morning. Check out that poll question and any messages you may have received on People. And please feel free to message to us on chat or your question and answer period. Thank you so much.
Thank you.